The attack on Venezuela was not about Venezuela. It was a signal that the United States is done pretending that power politics is over and done tolerating ambiguity in its own backyard. When Marco Rubio said this is the Western Hemisphere, he was not speaking diplomatically. He was drawing a line on the map. On the other side of that line stands China, quiet, patient, deeply embedded, with $518 billion in trade, with $303 billion in loans, with ports, railways, oil, and now credit denominated in renminbi. For years, Beijing expanded without firing a shot. Washington watched, calculated, and waited. Venezuela is where waiting ended. If you want to understand how the next global order is being shaped, pay attention now, because moments like this rarely announce themselves twice. But to grasp why this confrontation became inevitable, we need to step back and look at the structure beneath the shock. What we are witnessing is not a regional dispute and not a sudden escalation. It is the collision of two incompatible worldviews. The United States sees stability through dominance, clear hierarchies, clear spheres, clear consequences. Latin America, in that logic, is strategic depth, energy, trade routes, security. China sees the same region differently, as a network, a marketplace, a set of sovereign actors free to choose, not a backyard, not a buffer, but a platform. For 2 decades, these visions coexisted uneasily. Trade grew, loans flowed, infrastructure expanded, and Washington tolerated it until tolerance began to look like retreat. The attack on Venezuela marks the moment when competition crossed into enforcement, when influence became leverage and leverage became force. To understand why this shift feels so abrupt, we must look backward, because this rivalry did not begin with tanks or oil seizures. It began quietly, years ago. To understand this moment, we have to follow the long arc, not the headlines, the cycle. Over the past 2 decades, China moved into Latin America through economics, not armies. Trade first, then finance, then infrastructure. By 2024, trade reached $518 billion. Loans accumulated to $303 billion between 2000 and 2023. Credit arrived faster than Washington expected, and with fewer political conditions than the West demanded. For countries in the region, this was not ideology, it was liquidity, growth, options. Beijing framed its role carefully, opposing hegemonism, rejecting power politics, promising fairness, multilateralism, stable supply chains. The United States, meanwhile, saw something else forming: dependence, embedded leverage, and competitors making major inroads into the hemisphere. What looked like globalization to some began to look like encirclement to others, and once that perception set in, confrontation was no longer a question of if, only when. Then came the rupture, the attack on Venezuela, and the seizure of Russian-flagged oil tankers by U.S. forces. This was not symbolic pressure, it was kinetic power. For years, Venezuela had been a testing ground, a country under sanctions, under isolation, yet sustained by Chinese loans repaid in oil. In 2023, Beijing and Caracas announced a strategic partnership. On paper, it signaled protection. In reality, it revealed limits. When U.S. ships moved, China did not. No military deterrence, no counter-deployment, only silence. Across Latin America, leaders noticed, so did markets, so did generals. 2 Chinese supertankers turned back mid-voyage, not because of storms, but because of power. This was the first real stress test of China's promise in the hemisphere, and it failed. If you are watching closely, this moment matters, because credibility is the true currency of geopolitics, and it is earned or lost under pressure. But this crisis exposed something deeper than weakness. It revealed the system underneath, And that is where the real danger begins. Beneath the crisis lies a structural trap, not a misunderstanding, a mechanism. China's power in Latin America is financial, commercial, infrastructural, ports, railways, credit lines, supply chains, but not security guarantees. Its policy paper speaks of fairness, multilateralism, and opposing hegemonism. It offers markets, capital, diplomatic alignment. What it does not offer is protection when force is used. The United States operates differently. Its influence is enforced, backed by fleets, sanctions, and legal reach. This creates an asymmetry. Countries can borrow from China, trade with China, build with China, but when confrontation comes, they still calculate Washington's response first. That is the hidden cost of China's model, and the hidden strength of America's. The Venezuela episode made this visible. Painfully so. Economic power can stretch far, but without coercive backing, it bends under pressure. And once exposed, this imbalance invites escalation, because rivals do not test your intentions, they test your limits. And limits, once revealed, reshape behavior across an entire region. Pressure never stays contained, it migrates. After Venezuela, the tension did not dissipate, it accelerated. Washington's focus on its backyard sharpened, and with it, the risk of spillover. Chinese advisor Zheng Yongyan described the moment precisely: a feudalization of the international order, great powers carving zones, testing boundaries. Direct war remains unlikely, too costly, too destabilizing, but proxy conflict is different. Subtle, deniable, incremental. Latin American states now sit in between, leverage China's capital, rely on America's security. That balance is fragile. If a government tilts too far toward Beijing, it risks American retaliation. If Washington pushes too hard, it threatens Chinese interests embedded across the region. Oil, ports, railways. Venezuela was the warning shot, not the climax, because once influence becomes contested, every investment becomes a potential fault line. And when great powers compete this way, even infrastructure can turn into a battlefield, which raises a more uncomfortable question: what does this rivalry mean for the people living inside it? For you, this rivalry is not abstract, it is not theory, it is lived experience. When oil shipments stop, prices rise. When loans freeze, projects stall. When ports become strategic assets, jobs become leverage. You feel it in inflation, in uncertainty, in the quiet fear that decisions made far away now shape your future. Great powers speak of strategy. You live with consequences. In countries tied to Chinese financing, sudden pressure means austerity. In countries aligned with Washington, compliance becomes survival. Choice narrows. You are told this is about security, or development, or sovereignty, but what it often means is that your margin for error disappears. This is how geopolitics enters daily life, not with tanks, but with constraints. If you sense that the world feels less predictable, you are right. And if you want to understand why power is being exercised this way, stay with me. Because the forces reshaping your region are not stopping at national borders. They are going global. What happens in Latin America does not stay there. It never does, because this region sits at the intersection of energy, trade routes, and strategic infrastructure. When China finances ports, it is not just moving goods. It is shaping logistics, standards, dependence. The Chance megaport in Peru, operated by Costco Shipping, is not just concrete and cranes. It is access and potentially leverage. The proposed biooceanic corridor, costing up to $80 billion, would link the Pacific to the Atlantic, redrawing commercial geography. Washington understands this. That is why the Panama Canal, global ports, and waterways now trigger alarms, control choke points, and you influence flows far beyond the hemisphere. This rivalry feeds into supply chains, into manufacturing. into global inflation. A decision in Caracas can ripple into factories in Asia and consumers in Europe. That is the nature of interconnected power. Latin America is no longer a peripheral theater. It is a hinge, and when hinges are stressed, entire systems begin to creak, which leaves us with the hardest question of all. Where does this trajectory lead? From here, three futures emerge, not predictions, scenarios. The first is managed competition. The United States reasserts dominance selectively. China adapts, pulls back from confrontation, protects its investments quietly. Latin America hedges, no explosions, but no trust either. The second is sustained friction. Washington pressures harder. Beijing retaliates asymmetrically. Rare earths, finance, corporate access. Countries are forced to choose case by case. Uncertainty becomes permanent. The third is escalation, not direct war, but proxy clashes, asset seizures, sanction cycles, infrastructure turning strategic overnight, loans written off, credibility tested again. This is the danger of a feudalized order. Power replaces rules, influence replaces institutions. The tragedy is not that rivalry exists, it always has. The tragedy is that systems built to manage it are eroding. What happens next will not be decided by ideology alone, but by restraint, or the lack of it. And that brings us to the final insight. Venezuela was not an exception, it was a preview. A world where spheres of influence are enforced, not debated, where trade, finance, and infrastructure become instruments of power. The United States is signaling that ambiguity is over. China is discovering the limits of expansion without protection, and Latin America is caught in between. This is not a return to the Cold War. It is something colder, more transactional, less restrained. In this world, stability depends less on rules and more on how far great powers are willing to push and when they choose to stop. If you want to understand the next decade, do not watch speeches. Watch pressure points, ports, oil, choke points, because that is where the future is being negotiated. If this analysis helped you see the structure beneath the headlines, share it. Stay with this channel. The next chapter of global power is already unfolding.